Chapter 8. Wages, the price of labor power. Essential nature of wages under the capitalist mode of production. Labor power, like every other commodity, has value. The value of labor power, expressed in money, is the price of labor power. The price of labor power is unlike the price of other commodities. When a commodity producer sells cloth, say, in the market, the sum of money which he receives is simply the price of the commodity which he has sold. When a proletarian sells his labor power to a capitalist and obtains a certain sum of money in the form of wages, that sum of money appears not as the price of the commodity labor power but as the price of labor. This comes about for the following reasons. First, the capitalist pays the worker his wages after the worker has expended his labor. Second, wages are fixed either in accordance with the amount of time worked, in hours, days, weeks, or in accordance with the quantity of product produced. Let us take our previous example. Let us suppose that the worker works 12 hours a day. During 6 hours he produces the value of $6, equal to the value of his labor power. In the remaining 6 hours he produces the value of $6, which is appropriated by the capitalist as surplus value. As the employer has hired the proletarian for a full working day, he pays him $6 for the whole 12 hours of his labor. Thus a false impression is created, as though wages were the price of labor and $6 were full payment for the whole of the 12-hour working day. In fact, the $6 are only the value of 1 day's labor power, whereas the proletarian's labor has created value equal to $12. If wages at the given enterprise are worked out in relation to the product turned out, it looks as though the worker is paid for the labor expended in every unit of the commodity he has made, i.e., as above, that the whole of the labor expended by the worker has been fully paid for. This deceptive appearance is not an accidental delusion. It arises from the very conditions of capitalist production, under which exploitation is concealed, slurred over, and the relations between the employer and the wage worker appear in distorted form as relations between equal commodity producers. In reality, the wages of the wage worker are not the value or price of his labor. If we suppose that labor is itself a commodity and has value, then the magnitude of this value must be measured by some means. Evidently, the magnitude of the value of labor, as of any other commodity, must be measured by the amount of labor contained in it. Such a supposition creates a vicious circle. Labor is measured by labor. Further, if a capitalist were to pay a worker the value of his labor, i.e., were to pay for his labor to the full extent, there would then be no source for the capitalist's wealth, i.e., no surplus value, or, in other words, the capitalist mode of production could not exist. Labor is the creator of the value of commodities, but labor is not itself a commodity and has no value. What in everyday life is called the value of labor is in reality the value of labor power. The capitalist buys on the market not labor but a special commodity labor power. The use of labor power, i.e., the expenditure of the energy of the worker's muscles, nerves, and brain, is the process of labor. The value of labor power is always less than the value newly created by the worker's labor. Wages are the payment for only part of the working day, namely, for necessary labor time. But insofar as wages take the form of payment for labor, the impression is created that the whole of the working day is fully paid for. For this reason, Marx calls wages in bourgeois society the transmuted form of the value or price of labor power. Wages are not what they appear to be, namely the value or price of labor, but only a masked form for the value or price of labor power. Marx, Critique of the Gotha Program, Marx and Engels, Selected Works, 1950, English edition, Vol. 2, page 27. Wages are the monetary expression of the value of labor power, its price, outwardly appearing as the price of labor. Under slavery, no buying and selling of labor power takes place between slave owner and slave. The slave is the property of the slave owner. It therefore seems as though the whole of the slave's labor is given for nothing, that even that part of his labor which replaces what has been spent on his upkeep is unpaid labor, labor for the slave owner. In feudal society, the necessary labor of the peasant on his own holding and his surplus labor on the landlord's domain are distinctly separated in time and space. Under the capitalist system, even the unpaid labor of the wage worker appears to be paid for. Wages conceal all traces of the division of the working day into necessary and surplus labor time, into paid and unpaid labor, and so cover up the relation of capitalist exploitation. Basic forms of wages. The basic forms of wages are 1. Time wages, and 2. Piece wages, payment by the job. Time wages are that form of wages under which the magnitude of a worker's wages depends on the time which he works in hours, days, weeks, or months. In accordance with these units of time, we distinguish payment by the hour, by the day, by the week, by the month. With one and the same magnitude of time wages, the actual earnings of a worker can differ, depending on the length of the working day. The price of one working hour serves as the measure of payment to the worker for the labor expended by him in a unit of time. Although, as has been shown, labor itself has no value, nor, consequently, any price, the conventional name price of labor is used to define the size of a worker's earnings. The unit of measurement of the price of labor is provided by the payment for the labor of one working hour, or the price of 1 hour's work. Thus, if the average working day lasts 12 hours, and the average per day value of labor power is equivalent to $6, then the average price of a working hour, 600 cents divided by 12, will be 50 cents. Time wages enable the capitalist to intensify the exploitation of the worker by way of lengthening the working day to lower the price of a working hour, while leaving the wages per day, week, or month unchanged. Let us suppose that the daily rate of payment remains as before, $6, but the working day is increased from 12 to 13 hours. In such a case, the price of one working hour, 600 cents divided by 13, will be reduced from 50 to 46 cents. Under pressure of the workers' demands, the capitalist is sometimes obliged to raise the daily, and, accordingly, the weekly and monthly rate of wages, but the price of one working hour may nevertheless remain unchanged or even decline. Thus, if the daily wage is raised from $6 to $6.20, while the working day is increased from 12 to 14 hours, the price of a working hour is thereby reduced, 620 cents divided by 14, to 44 cents. The growth in the intensity of labor means in practice also a fall in the price of a working hour, since the payment remains the same for a greater output of energy, equivalent to a lengthening of the working day. As a result of the fall in the price of a working hour, the proletariat, in order to exist, is obliged to agree to a further lengthening of the working day. Both the lengthening of the working day and the unbounded intensification of labor lead to increased expenditure of labor power and to its being undermined. The lower the payment for each hour, the greater the amount of labor or the longer the working day that is needed for the worker to secure even a low wage. From another aspect, the lengthening of the working period brings in its turn a lowering of the payment for a working hour. The capitalist makes use in his own interests of the circumstance that, with a lengthening of the working day or an increase in the intensity of labor, the payment for 1 hour labor is reduced. When conditions are favorable for the sale of commodities, he lengthens the working day, introduces overtime, i.e., work beyond the established duration of the working day. If market conditions are unfavorable and the capitalist is forced temporarily to reduce the extent of his production, he reduces the working day and introduces hourly rates of payment. Hourly rates, when the working day or working week are incomplete, sharply reduce earnings. If, in our example, the working day be shortened from 12 to 6 hours while the rate of payment for labor remains, as before, 50 cents per hour, then the daily earnings for a worker amount in all to $3, i.e., they will be half the daily value of labor power. Thus, the worker loses in earnings not only when the working day is lengthened beyond the usual duration but also when he is obliged to work short time. The capitalist can now wring from the laborer a certain quantity of surplus labor without allowing him the labor time necessary for his own subsistence. He can annihilate all regularity of employment and, according to his own convenience, caprice and the interest of the moment make the most enormous overwork alternate with relative or absolute cessation of work. Marx, Capital, Kerr edition, Vol. 1, page 597. With time wages, the size of the worker's earnings bear no direct relation to the degree of intensity of his labor. If the intensity of labor is increased, time wages are not raised and in fact the price of a working hour falls. So as to intensify exploitation, the capitalist employs special overlookers who see that the workers obey capitalist labor discipline and intensify this discipline still further. Time wages were widespread in the early stages of the development of capitalism, when the employer, meeting as yet little organized resistance from the workers, was in a position to increase surplus value by lengthening the working day. Time wages have been retained, however, even in the highest phase of capitalism. In a number of cases, they offer several advantages to the capitalist. Through speeding up the movement of the machinery, the capitalist obliges the workers to work still more intensively, without increasing their wages. Piece wages, payment by results, is that form of wages under which the size of the worker's earnings depends on the quantity of articles or separate parts which he produces, or the number of operations he completes, in a given unit of time. Under time wages, payment for labor expended varies with its length. Under piece wages, it varies with the amount of articles produced or operations completed, each of which is paid for at a definite rate. In fixing the rate, the capitalist takes into account, first, the time wages of the worker per day and, second, the amount of articles or parts which the worker produces in the course of a day. Usually he fixes the production quota at the highest level attained by a worker. If the average daily wage in the given ranch of production under time wages amounts to $6, and the quantity of articles of a particular kind produced by a worker is 60, then the piece rate for an article or part will be 10 cents. In fixing the piece rate, the capitalists strive that the hourly, daily, weekly earnings of a worker should not be higher than under time wages. Thus, piece wages are fundamentally a modified form of time wages. Piece wages, even more than time wages, give rise to the deceptive appearance that the worker is selling the capitalist not labor power but labor, and is receiving full payment for his labor in accordance with the amount he produces. Capitalist piece wage systems lead to continually greater intensification of labor. In addition, they help the entrepreneur in the matter of supervision of the workers. The degree of intensity of labor is here controlled by the quantity and quality of the product which the worker must make in order to obtain the means of subsistence which he needs. The worker is compelled to increase his output by working more intensively. But as soon as a more or less considerable section of the workers achieve the new, heightened level of intensity of labor, the capitalist lowers the piece rates. If, in our example, the piece rate is halved, say, the worker is obliged, in order to keep his earnings at their former level, to work twice as hard, i.e., either to work longer hours or to work at still greater intensity, so that in one day he can produce not 60 but 120 parts. The worker tries to keep up the amount of his wages by working more, whether by working longer hours or by producing more in 1 hour. The result is that the more he works, the less wages he receives. Marx, Wage, Labor and Capital, Marx and Engels, Selected Works, 1950, English edition, Vol. 1, page 95. This is the most important peculiarity of piece wages under capitalism. Time and piece forms of wages are often in force at the same time in one and the same enterprise. Under capitalism, both of these forms of wages are only different ways of intensifying the exploitation of the working class. Capitalist piecework provides the basis for the sweating systems of wages which are applied in capitalist countries. Sweating systems of wages. The most important feature of capitalist piecework is the unbounded intensification of work, which drains the worker's entire strength. At the same time, the wages paid do not compensate for this increased expenditure of labor power. Beyond the limits of a certain length and intensity of work, no additional payment can avert direct destruction of labor power. As a result of the use in capitalist enterprises of exhausting methods of organizing labor, towards the end of the working day, an overstrain of the worker's muscular and nervous strength usually makes itself felt, which leads to a falling off in the productivity of labor. In his pursuit of increased surplus value, the capitalist resorts to various sweating systems of wages, so as to achieve a high intensity of labor throughout the entire length of the working day. Under capitalism, it is such aims as these that are served by the so-called scientific organization of labor. Widespread forms of such organization of labor, with use of wage systems which are extremely exhausting in their effect on the worker, are Taylorism and Fordism, underlying both of which is the principle of raising the intensity of labor to the maximum. The essence of Taylorism, the system is named after its devisor, the American engineer F. Taylor, is as follows. The strongest and most dexterous workers in the enterprise are picked out. They are obliged to work at their maximum intensity. Their execution of each separate operation is timed in seconds and fractions of a second. On the basis of the data obtained by this time study, a production regime and time norms are laid down for the whole mass of the workers. When he overfulfills the norm, the job, the worker receives a small addition to his daily wage, a bonus. If the norm is not fulfilled, the worker is paid at a lower rate. Capitalist organization of labor in accordance with Taylor's system sucks out all the worker's strength and transforms him into an automaton mechanically performing the same movements over and over again. Vi. Lenin gives an actual example, the work of loading pig iron onto a truck, where, with the introduction of Taylor's system into the execution of one operation alone, a capitalist was able to reduce the number of workers from 500 to 140, i.e., to divide it by 3.6. By monstrously intensifying the work, the daily norm of a worker engaged in loading was raised from 16 to 59 tons, i.e., multiplied by 3.7. While a worker now carried out in one-day work which previously he had taken 3 to 4 days to carry out, his daily wages normally increased, and then only for a time, by only 63% in all. In other words, with the introduction of this system of payment, the daily earnings of a worker were divided, in fact, if one compares them with the labor expended, by 2.3. As a result, wrote Lenin, in those same 9 to 10 hours of work 3 times as much labor is extorted from the worker. All his strength is ruthlessly exhausted. Every drop of the wage slave's nervous and muscular energy is sucked out of him at treble speed. Does he die sooner than he would have done? There are many others at the gate. Lenin, A Scientific System of Squeezing Out Sweat, Works, Russian edition, Vol 18, p. 556. Lenin called such ways of organizing the worker's labor and wages a scientific system of squeezing out sweat. The system of organizing labor and wages introduced by the American automobile king H. Ford and other capitalists, the system of Fordism, has the same aim, that of extracting the largest possible amount of surplus value by maximizing the intensity of labor. This it achieves by continually greater speeding up of the conveyor belts and introduction of sweating systems of wage payment. The simplicity of the work operations performed by a worker at one of Ford's conveyor belts makes it possible to use the labor of unskilled workers on a wide scale and to fix a low rate of wages for them. The tremendous intensification of labor is not accompanied by any increase in wages or reduction of working hours. The result is that the worker quickly becomes worn out and transformed into a sick man. He is dismissed from the works as unfit and falls into the ranks of the unemployed. Intensified exploitation of the workers is attained also by other systems of organizing labor and wages which are variants of Taylorism and Fordism. Among these is the Gantt system, USA. Unlike Taylor's piecework system, the Gantt system is one of time bonuses. The worker is assigned a certain job, and a very low guaranteed payment is fixed for a unit of working time, regardless of fulfillment of the norm. If he fulfills the norm, the worker is paid a small addition to his guaranteed minimum a bonus. The Halsey system, USA, is based on the principle of bonus payments for time saved, supplementing an average wage per hour's work. Under this system, for example, when the intensity of labor is doubled, for every hour of saved time a bonus is paid, amounting to about a third of the hourly rate. By this method, the more intensive the worker's labor, the greater the degree to which his wages fall in relation to the labor he expends. The Rowan system, Britain, is based on the same principles. A method of increasing surplus value which is grounded in deception of the workers is so-called profit sharing. On the pretext of giving the workers an interest in raising the profitability of the enterprise, the capitalist lowers the workers' wages, and at their expense sets up a fund for distribution of profits among the workers. Later on, towards the end of the year, the worker is paid under the name of profit, what is in fact part of the wages which had previously been kept back from him. In the end, the worker who is sharing the profits receives in fact less than the usual wages. For the same purpose, shares in an enterprise are distributed among the workers. The capitalist's tricks in all kinds of wage systems are aimed at extracting as much surplus value as possible from the workers. The employers use such methods in order to befuddle the workers' minds with an imaginary interest in intensifying labor, reducing expenditure on wages per unit of production and raising the profits of the concern. In this way, the capitalist strives to weaken the proletariat's resistance to the offensive of capital, to induce the workers to refuse to join trade unions or take part in strikes, and to bring about a split in the labor movement. Behind all the various forms of capitalist piecework, the essence remains the same. As the intensity and productivity of labor is raised, the workers' earnings in fact fall while the capitalist's income increases. Nominal and real wages in the early stage of capitalism's development, payment of wages to the workers in kind was widespread. The worker received shelter, some meager food, and a little money. Wages in kind survived to some extent even into the machine period of capitalism. They existed, for instance, in the extractive and textile industries of pre-revolutionary Russia. Wages in kind are widespread in capitalist agriculture where the labor of poor peasants is used, in certain branches of industry in the capitalist countries, and in the colonial and dependent countries. The forms in which the worker is paid in kind vary. The capitalists place the workers in a position where they are forced to take food on credit from the factory shop, to lease a dwelling near the mine or on the plantation on oppressive terms fixed by their employer, etc. Under methods of wage payment in kind, the capitalist exploits the wage worker not only as a seller of labor power but also as a consumer. Money wages are characteristic of the capitalist mode of production in its developed form. Nominal wages must be distinguished from real wages. Nominal wages are wages expressed in money, the sum of money which the worker receives from the sale of his labor power to the capitalist. Nominal wages do not in themselves give any idea of the actual level of payment received by the worker. For example, nominal wages may remain unchanged, but if at the same time taxes and the prices of consumer goods rise, the worker's actual wages fall. Nominal wages may even increase, but if the cost of living rises to a greater extent in the same period of time, then in fact wages have fallen. Real wages are wages expressed in terms of the worker's means of subsistence. They show how many and what kinds of consumer goods and services a worker can buy with his money wages. To determine a worker's real wage, one must start the size of his nominal wages, the level of prices of goods, the level of rents, the burden of taxes borne by the workers, the circumstances that some days he may receive no wages owing to short-time working, and the number of unemployed and semi-unemployed who are supported by the working class. One must also take into account the length of the working day and the degree of intensity of labor. In determining the average level of wages, bourgeois statistics distort reality. They include in wages the incomes of the upper administrative groups of the industrial and financial bureaucracy, managers of enterprises, bank directors, etc., include only the wages of skilled workers in the category of wages while excluding from it the numerous stratum of poorly paid, unskilled workers and the agricultural proletariat. Ignore the huge army of unemployed and semi-unemployed, the rise in the prices of mass consumer goods and in taxation, and resort to other methods of falsification so as to embellish the situation of the working class under capitalism. Even falsified bourgeois statistics cannot, however, hide the fact that wages under capitalism, owing to their low level, the raising of the cost of living and the growth of unemployment fail to guarantee a living wage to the majority of the workers. In 1938, some bourgeois economists in the USA worked out, using extremely modest standards, a living wage for a worker's family consisting of 4 persons, $2,177 a year. Yet in 1938, the average wage per head of an industrial worker in the USA amounted to $1,176, i.e., considerably less than half of his living wage. If the unemployed were brought into the calculation, the figure came to $740, i.e., only a third of this subsistence minimum. In 1937, a quite humble living wage for an average worker's family in Britain was defined by some bourgeois economists at 55s a week. Official figures showed that 80% of the workers in the coal industry, 75% of the workers in the extractive industries other than coal mining, and 57% of municipal workers in Britain were being paid less than this subsistence minimum. Decline of real wages under capitalism. On the basis of his analysis of the capitalist mode of production, Marx established the following fundamental law relating to wages. The general tendency of capitalist production is not to raise but to sink the average standard of wages. Marx, Wages, Price and Profit, Marx and Engels, Selected Works, 1950, English edition, Vol I, page 405. Wages as the price of labor power, like the price of any other commodity, are determined by the law of value. The prices of commodities vary in capitalist economy both above and below their value, under the influence of supply and demand. But unlike the prices of other commodities, the price of labor power, as a rule, tends to fall below its value. This tendency of wages to fall below the value of labor power is due above all to the existence of unemployment. The capitalist tries to buy labor power as cheap as he can. When there is unemployment, the supply of labor power exceeds the demand for it. The commodity labor power differs from others in that the proletarian cannot put off selling it. So as not to die of hunger, He is compelled to sell his labor power on whatever terms the capitalist offers him. In periods of complete or partial unemployment, the worker is either entirely without wages or else their level falls sharply. When there is unemployment, this intensifies competition among the workers. Taking advantage of this, the capitalist pays the worker wages which are less than the value of his labor power. In this way, the wretched situation of the unemployed, who form part of the working class, has an effect on the material position of the workers in employment, reducing the level of their wages. Furthermore, the use of machinery provides the capitalist with extensive opportunities of substituting female and child labor for men's. The value of labor power is determined by the value of the means of subsistence which are needed by a worker and his family. When, therefore, the worker's wife and children are drawn into production, the worker's wages fall, and the entire family now receives approximately the same amount as previously was received by the head of the family only. This by itself means that the working class as a whole is being exploited still more intensely. In capitalist countries, women workers doing the same work as men are paid considerably less wages. Capital extorts surplus value by unrestrainedly exploiting child labor. The wages of children and youths are much lower than those of adult workers in all capitalist and colonial countries. The average wage of a woman worker is lower than the average wage of a male worker by 41% in the USA, 1949, 46% in Great Britain, 1951, and 42% in Western Germany, 1951. The difference is even more marked in colonial and dependent countries. In the USA in 1949, according to conservative figures, more than 3,300,000 of the wage workers were children and youths. The working day for children and youths is very long. Thus, in starch works and in canning and meat factories, laundries and dry cleaning workshops, children work 12 to 13 hours a day. In Japan, the practice of selling children for work in the factories is widespread. Child labor was employed extensively in Tsarist Russia. A considerable section of the workers in textile and several other kinds of enterprise in Russia was made up of children aged 8 to 10. The exploitation of child labor by capital assumes particularly cruel forms in colonial and dependent countries. In the textile and tobacco factories of Turkey, children of 7 to 14 work a full working day, the same as adults. The low wages of women workers and the exploitation of child labor brings in its train a tremendous growth of sickness and child mortality, and has a baneful effect on the upbringing and education of the rising generation. The decline in the workers' real wages is caused also by the fact that, as capitalism develops, the position of a substantial section of the skilled workers deteriorates. As already mentioned, the expenses of a worker's training enter into the value of his labor power. A skilled worker creates more value, including surplus value, in a given unit of time than an unskilled worker. The capitalist is obliged to pay for skilled labor more than he pays for unskilled. But as capitalism develops with the growth of industrial technique, while on the one hand there arises a demand for highly skilled workers, able to control and operate complicated mechanisms, on the other hand, many work operations are simplified and the labor of a considerable section of the skilled workers becomes redundant. Considerable sections of the skilled workers lose their skill, are pushed out of employment and are forced to take up unskilled work which is paid a great deal less. The rise in the cost of living and the fall in the level of real wages connected with this are caused also by the rise in prices of mass consumer goods. Thus, in France, on account of inflation, retail prices of foodstuffs stood in 1938 at a level more than 7 times as high as in 1914. A considerable part of the workers' wages is absorbed by rent. In Germany between 1900 and 1930, the average rent grew by 69%. According to the figures of the International Labor Office, in the 1930s the workers spent on rent, heating and lighting, in the USA 25% of their family budgets, in Britain 20% and in Canada 27%. In Tsarist Russia, workers' expenditure on housing came to as much as a third of their wages. Taxes which fall on the working people make a big deduction from their wages. In the principal capitalist countries in the post-war period, direct and indirect taxes absorb as much as a third of the wages of a working-class family. One widespread method of reducing wages was the system of fines. In Tsarist Russia, until the promulgation of the law on fines, 1886, which somewhat restricted the arbitrary behavior of the factory owners, Deductions from wages in the shape of fines amounted in certain cases to as much as half the monthly earnings of a worker. A worker was fined on every kind of pretext: for unsatisfactory work, for breach of regulations, for talking, for taking part in demonstrations, etc. Fines serve not only as a means of strengthening capitalist labor discipline, but also as a source of additional income for the capitalist. Another factor in the decline of the workers' real wages is the exceptionally low wages received by the agricultural proletariat. The great army of surplus labor power in the countryside exerts a constant downward pressure on the wage level of the employed workers. Thus, for example, during the period 1910 to 39, the average monthly wage of an agricultural worker in the USA varied between 28 to 47% of the wage of an industrial worker. The situation of the agricultural workers in Tsarist Russia was an exceptionally hard one. For a working day of 16 to 17 hours, the average daily wage drawn by a seasonal agricultural worker in Russia in 1901 to 10 amounted to 69 kopecks, and the miserable pay which he thus obtained during plowing, sowing, and harvest periods had to support him during the remaining months of the year when he was completely or partially unemployed. So, with the development of the capitalist mode of production, the real wages of the working class suffer a reduction. In 1924, the real wages of the German workers were 75% of what they had been in 1900, and in 1935 they were 66%. In the USA, the average nominal wages of the workers, unemployed included, grew by 68% between 1900 and 1938. In the same period, however, the cost of living rose to 2.3 times its height at the beginning of the century, so that the workers' real wages fell by much as 74% between these years. In France, Italy, and Japan, not to speak of the colonial and dependent countries, the decline in real wages in the 19th to 20th centuries was considerably greater than in the USA. In Tsarist Russia in 1913, the real wages of industrial workers had fallen by not less than 90% from the level in 1900. The value of labor power is not identical in all countries. The conditions which determine the value of labor power vary from one country to another. This fact gives rise to national differences in wages. Marx wrote that, in making comparisons between wages in different countries, one must take into account all the factors which determine variations in the magnitude of the value of labor power, the historical conditions under which the working class was formed and its established level of requirements, the cost of training a worker, the part played by the labor of women and children, the productivity of labor, the intensity of labor, the prices of consumer goods, etc. An especially low level of wages is to be observed in colonial and dependent countries. In carrying out its policy of enslaving and systematically plundering the colonial and dependent countries, capital takes advantage of the great surplus of working hands available in those countries and pays for labor power at very much less than its value. In this connection, the worker's nationality is taken into account. Thus, for instance, whites and Negroes doing the same work are paid at different rates. In South Africa, the average wage of a Negro worker is only 1/10 that of a white worker. In the USA, Negroes in the cities are paid 2/5 as much, and in agriculture hardly 1/3 as much as whites who do the same work. The bourgeoisie creates, at the expense of the lowered wages of the basic mass of the workers and the plunder of the colonies, privileged conditions for a relatively small stratum of well-paid workers. The bourgeoisie uses the so-called aristocracy of labor formed from these well-paid strata, including a section of trade union officials and cooperative bureaucrats, some of the foremen, etc., for the purpose of splitting the labor movement and poisoning the consciousness of the basic mass of proletarians with preachings about class peace and the unity of interests between exploiters and exploited. The struggle of the working class to raise wages in each country. A certain level of wages is established on the basis of the law of the value of labor power, as a result of a fierce class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The extent to which wages can diverge from the value of labor power has its limits. The minimum limit of wages under capitalism is fixed by purely physical conditions. The worker must have that quantity of means of subsistence which he needs absolutely in order to live and reproduce his labor power. If the price of labor power falls to this minimum, it falls below its value, since under such circumstances, it can be maintained and developed only in a crippled state. Marx, Capital, Kerr edition, Vol. 1, page 192. When wages fall below this limit, there occurs an accelerated process of direct physical destruction of labor power and dying off of the working population. This finds expression in a shortening of the average expectation of life, a fall in the birth rate and an increase in the mortality rate among the working population, both in the developed countries and also and especially in the colonial countries. The maximum limit of wages under capitalism is the value of labor power. The degree to which the average level of wages approximates to this limit is determined by the relation of class forces as between proletariat and bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie endeavors, in its striving for greater profits, to reduce wages below the physical minimum limit. The working class fights against cuts in wages and for increased wages, for the establishment of a guaranteed minimum wage, for the introduction of social insurance, and for a shorter working day. In this struggle, the working class is opposed by the capitalist class as a whole and by the bourgeois state. The stubborn struggle waged by the working class to raise wages had its beginning along with the rise of industrial capitalism. It developed first in Britain and later spread to the other capitalist countries and to the colonies. As the proletariat takes shape as a class, the workers come together in trade unions for the purpose of successfully conducting their economic struggle. The result of this is that the employer finds himself opposed no longer by individual proletarians but by an entire organization. With the development of the class struggle, besides local and national trade unions, there came into being international associations of trade unions. The trade unions provide a school of class struggle for the broad masses of the workers. On their part, the capitalists come together in employers' associations. They bribe venal and reactionary trade union officials, organize strike-breaking, split the workers' organizations, and use the police, troops, courts, and prisons to suppress the labor movement. One of the effective methods of struggle used by the workers under capitalism to secure increased wages, shorter working hours, and improved conditions of work is the strike. As class contradictions become more acute and the working class movement becomes better organized in the capitalist and colonial countries, many millions of workers are drawn into strike struggles. When workers struggling against capital show determination and stubbornness, economic strikes force the capitalists to accept the strikers' terms. It is only as a result of the unremitting struggle of the working class for its vital interests that the bourgeois states are compelled to promulgate laws on minimum wages, on reduction of working hours, and on restriction of child labor. The economic struggle of the proletariat is of great importance. As a rule, trade unions under steadfast class leadership put up a successful resistance to the employers. The struggle of the working class is a factor which to a certain extent restricts the fall in wages. But the economic struggle of the working class cannot abolish the system of capitalist enslavement of the working people and deliver the workers from exploitation and want. While recognizing the great importance of the economic struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie, Marxism-Leninism teaches that this struggle is directed merely against the consequences of capitalism and not against the root cause of the oppressed situation and poverty of the proletariat. This root cause is the capitalist mode of production itself. Only through revolutionary political struggle can the working class abolish the system of wage slavery, the source of its economic and political oppression. Brief conclusions. 1. In capitalist society, wages are the monetary expression of the value of labor power, its price, appearing to be the price of labor. Wages hide the relationship of capitalist exploitation, creating the false impression that all the worker's labor is paid for, whereas in reality wages constitute only the price of his labor power. 2. The main forms of wages are time wages and piece wages. Under the time wage system, the size of the worker's wage packet depends on the time he spends at work. Under the piece wage system, the size of the worker's wage packet depends on the number of articles he produces. For the purpose of increasing surplus value, the capitalists employ a variety of sweating systems of wage payment, which lead to a tremendous increase in the intensity of labor and to an accelerated wearing out of labor power. 3. Nominal wages are the amount of money received by the worker for the labor power which he sells to the capitalist. Real wages are wages expressed in terms of the worker's means of subsistence. They show what quantity of means of subsistence and services the worker can buy for his money wages. 4. As capitalism develops, real wages fall. Unlike the prices of other commodities, the price of labor power, as a rule, fluctuates below its value. This is due above all to the existence of unemployment, to extensive use of female and child labor, and to the paying of extremely low wages to the agricultural workers and also to the workers in the colonial and dependent countries. An important factor in the decline in real wages is the rise in the prices of consumer goods, high rents, and the growth of taxation. 5. The working class, united in trade unions, conducts a struggle to shorten working hours and raise wages. The economic struggle of the proletariat against capital cannot by itself free the proletariat from exploitation. Only with the liquidation of the capitalist mode of production through revolutionary political struggle can the conditions be eliminated under which the working class is economically and politically oppressed.